He stood in our kitchen and coldly said my dying father was my problem alone, while his greedy family secretly drained thousands from my accounts. Every single month, he stood in our kitchen and told me my dying father was not his problem, while his own family had been robbing me blind for years. I was crying when he said it. My hands were shaking around my phone. My mother had just told me my father collapsed on the porch of the house I grew up in, and the paramedics were calling it a stroke. Julian looked at me the way you look at a stranger asking for spare change. Your money is yours, he said. My money is mine. I stopped crying right there. Something in my chest went very still and very cold. I smiled at him. He mistook it for surrender. 20 days after I cut off the $2,500 a month his family had been secretly draining from me, his entire perfect little dynasty came crashing down around his polished shoes. My name is Imani Whitfield. I was 32 years old that spring, and I owned a PR agency in Charlotte that brought in 3 times what Julian made as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company. He needed to feel like the man of the house, so for 6 years I let him believe his salary was what kept our penthouse lit and our refrigerator full. It wasn't. I was. I told myself it was a small lie, a kindness, the kind of thing a good wife does to protect her husband's pride. I didn't know yet how expensive that kindness would turn out to be. We need to pull $15,000 from savings, I told him. Tonight. My dad needs rehab or he loses mobility in his left side for good. He didn't turn around from the mirror. He was fixing his tie, the navy one I'd bought him for his promotion. The one I'd had monogrammed at a shop on Providence Road because I thought a small gesture like that would make him feel like he'd earned something. Imani, we are not doing this, he said, like he was declining a request for overtime. I'm not draining our assets to bail out a retired mailman. Your parents are your problem. My mother was still on speakerphone on the counter behind me, crying so hard I could barely make out her words between them. She'd found my father collapsed on the porch swing, his coffee mug shattered on the concrete beside him, his right side working fine while his left arm hung useless against the armrest. He'd tried to say her name, and it came out wrong, slurred into something that wasn't quite a word, and that detail alone had been enough to send her running for the phone instead of to him, because some part of her already knew what it meant. I could hear the paramedics in the background asking her questions about his medications, his allergies, whether he'd fallen before. I muted the call so she wouldn't hear what was about to happen in my kitchen. I wish some days that I hadn't. I wish she'd heard exactly what her son-in-law was made of the same moment I did. I stood there in my own kitchen, in the penthouse I paid for, and listened to a man wearing a suit I'd financed lecture me about financial responsibility. You're right, I said very quietly. Separate finances, starting now. He smiled. He actually smiled, like he'd won something. He had no idea what he'd just started. 10 minutes later, his sister Brianna and her husband Grant let themselves into my home without knocking, the way they always did, because Julian had given them a key without asking me. Grant went straight to my refrigerator and took one of the imported beers I keep for clients, cracked it open on my marble counter, and left a thin, gray scratch I would find later with my fingertip. He didn't ask about my father. He said, "This is exactly the dependency culture I talk about on my podcast, Imani. You people need to learn to bootstrap." Julian laughed. My own husband laughed at that, in my own kitchen, while my father lay in a hospital bed 40 minutes away. I didn't scream. I filed it away, the way I file away everything, in the part of my mind that keeps receipts. I made myself a cup of tea I never drank, sat on the edge of our bed after Brianna and Grant finally left, and listened to Julian tell me through the bathroom door while he brushed his teeth that I was overreacting, that Grant's comment had just been a joke, that my father would be fine, people survive strokes all the time, my mother was always a little dramatic about health stuff. I didn't answer him. I sat very still and watched the numbers on my phone screen instead. The $15,000 I still needed to move, the clock ticking toward a night I would spend awake regardless of what he believed about my reaction. Somewhere underneath the calm, a decision was already forming, the kind that doesn't announce itself with anger, just a quiet, permanent recalculation of what I owed this man and what I didn't. That night, once Julian was asleep, snoring the satisfied snore of a man who thought he'd made a point, I opened our joint banking app to wire my father's rehab money myself, quietly, without another argument. The balance was wrong. $15,000 had already left that account that same afternoon, hours before my mother had even called me about the stroke. The destination read Zenith Ventures LLC. My husband had stolen my father's rehab money to fund his brother-in-law's imaginary company, and then stood in our kitchen and let that same man lecture me about bootstrapping. I want to back up, because none of this happened in a vacuum. I met Julian 9 years earlier, at a fundraising gala for a children's literacy nonprofit my agency represented pro bono. He was 26 then, charming in the specific way of men who have never had to work very hard for anything, dressed better than his paycheck should have allowed. I found out later that his mother, Dolores, had bought that suit. I should have paid closer attention to that detail. I didn't. I was 23, flattered, and I liked how he made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. I should say I kept my maiden name professionally even after marriage, which Dolores found mildly scandalous and mentioned at least twice a year for the first 3 years, always framed as concern rather than criticism. "It's just confusing for clients," she'd say, "when your name doesn't match your husband's." I never explained to her that I'd built the agency under that name 3 years before I met her son, back when I was 23 and renting a single-room office above a dry cleaner on Central Avenue, cold calling small businesses for their first press releases at rates I now consider father embarrassingly low. I didn't owe Dolores my origin story. I'd learned early that people who ask questions like that aren't usually looking for the answer. They're looking for the opening. We married when I was 26. By then, my agency, Whitfield Media Group, had already landed its first six-figure retainer. A regional grocery chain rebranding after a food safety scandal, I helped them survive. A win that still shows up in my case study deck today because it was the account that finally let me hire a second employee and move out of the office above the dry cleaner. Julian was still a junior account rep at a medical device company, making $61,000 a year. I never held that against him. What I held against him eventually was what he did with the gap between us. His family noticed the gap first. Dolores Whitfield, his mother, was 60 when I married into that family, a retired school administrator with a talent for turning generosity into obligation. She had a way of framing every kindness as a debt not yet called in, and a way of framing every debt as evidence of how much she loved you. At our engagement dinner, at a steakhouse on East Boulevard she'd chosen without asking me, she toasted us and said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Julian has always known how to find the right kind of woman, one who understands what a man needs to feel like a man." I laughed along with everyone else because I didn't yet understand that she was giving instructions, not a compliment. I understood it better too. Thanksgivings later, my first one hosting at our old apartment before the penthouse, when Dolores arrived, looked around the space I'd spent $400 decorating for the occasion, and announced to the table that she always worried Julian would end up with someone who made him feel small for not making more money. I remember Julian laughing, uncomfortable but not defensive, the way you laugh when someone says something true enough to sting, but you'd rather not examine why. I remember deciding, in that moment, to spend the rest of the meal making sure nobody at that table ever again had reason to think I was making Julian feel small. And I remember not noticing, not for years, that the correction I made wasn't to Dolores's rudeness. It was to my own visibility. I got smaller instead. That was the trade nobody named out loud, but everybody in that family understood. The first real incident, the one I should have read as a warning instead of an anomaly, happened 18 months into our marriage. Brianna, Julian's younger sister, was 24 at the time and between jobs, as she often was. She asked to borrow $800 for a security deposit on an apartment in South End. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Family helps family. 3 months later, I found out, by accident, scrolling past her Instagram at a nail salon, that she and Grant had used that money as a down payment on a leased BMW instead. When I brought it up to Julian, gently, not even accusing, just confused, he told me I was being petty. "It's $800, Imani. You make that in an afternoon. Why does it matter where it went?" It mattered because it was never about the $800. It was about the lie sitting inside the ask. When I finally raised it with Brianna directly, months later, over coffee, trying to sound curious rather than accusing, she looked at me with genuine confusion, like I'd asked her something in a foreign language. "It's not that deep, Imani," she said. "You have money. We needed the car more than the deposit mattered." I remember the specific silence that followed, the way I sat there recalibrating what family helps family actually meant to people who'd grown up believing help was owed to them rather than given by choice. But I let it go, because that's what you do when you love someone, and you want to believe the best about the people who raised him. And because Julian, when I brought it up, told me I was keeping score in a way that wasn't attractive, a phrase that lodged itself somewhere I didn't examine again for 6 years. Grant came into the family 2 years after Julian and I married, when he married Brianna in a wedding I paid for almost entirely, $41,000 at a vineyard outside Asheville, because Dolores told me it would mean so much to Brianna to have her big brother's family show up strong. I remember writing that check and feeling, underneath the generosity, a small warning I didn't listen to. Nobody had asked Brianna's own parents-in-law, Grant's family, to contribute a comparable amount, and nobody seemed to think that was strange except me. Grant had a business degree from a school I'd never heard of and a personality built entirely around self-help podcasts. He called himself an entrepreneur. What he actually was, for most of the 6 years I knew him, was unemployed with a rotating cast of business names. Zenith Ventures was the fourth one. Before that, there had been Vantage Nutrition, a supplement company that sold protein powder out of Grant's garage for 11 months before a cease and desist letter over unsubstantiated health claims ended it quietly. Before that, there had been Property Path Academy, a real estate education platform that charged $800 for a weekend seminar and folded after refund complaints outpaced enrollment. Before that, the one Julian still brought up fondly as though it had been a success, a men's leadership retreat in the Smoky Mountains that lost $11,000 on a single event with 14 attendees, 4 of whom later asked for their money back after the promised Wilderness Accountability Circle turned out to be Grant reading affirmations off his phone by a fire pit. I financed pieces of all of it, though I didn't fully understand that until much later. A bridge loan here, an emergency inventory purchase there, always funneled through Julian, always described to me in terms vague enough that I never asked the follow-up question that would have made the pattern visible. I trusted my husband's account of his family's finances the same way I trusted his account of his own, which is to say completely, and without the professional scrutiny I would have applied to a client's books in a heartbeat. Julian funded pieces of all of them. I didn't know that yet, not the full scope of it, not the pattern. What I knew was smaller and more insidious. the recurring $2,500 a month that left our joint account and went to Dolores, which Julian had explained to me 6 years earlier as helping mom with her mortgage since dad passed. I believed him because it sounded reasonable, because Dolores's husband, Julian's father Marcus, had died of a heart attack when Julian was 29, and because I am, by nature, a person who wants to believe grief deserves generosity. Marcus had left a modest life insurance policy, $40,000, and I later learned Dolores received the full payout as sole beneficiary despite Julian and Brianna both assuming, incorrectly, that it would be split 3 ways. Julian never contested it. He told me once, early in our marriage, that he didn't want to make his mother's grief about money, a sentiment that sounded noble at the time and reads very differently to me now. Knowing what I know about how easily that same family could weaponize money when it suited them, what I did not know was that Dolores had paid off her mortgage 2 years before that conversation, using a portion of that same insurance payout, which meant the $2,500 a month Julian asked me to send her afterward was never replacing a bill that still existed. It was replacing a version of the story that made the request sound necessary instead of optional. What I did not know was that the $2,500 a month was being split 3 ways behind my back, some to Dolores's country club dues, some to Brianna's credit cards, and a growing slice, especially in the last year, straight into Grant's ventures. What I did not know, sitting in my own kitchen that rainy Tuesday, was that I had been quietly financing my own disrespect for years, one automatic transfer at a time. I didn't confront Julian that night. I've learned in 9 years with that family that confrontation without leverage is just noise they can talk over. So I did something quieter first. I opened my private business account, the one Julian didn't know existed, funded entirely from a consulting contract I'd never folded into our joint finances, and I wired $30,000 to Presbyterian Rehabilitation Center myself, paid in full, under a minute, before 6 in the morning. I called the rehab center's admissions line first. A woman named Carol, who spoke to me with a gentleness I badly needed at 5 in the morning, and confirmed the bed would be held, that my father could be transferred from the ICU as soon as his neurologist cleared him. My father would have his bed. My mother would have her nights back. That part at least was settled. Then I went looking for the rest of it. It didn't take much. I am, professionally, a person who reads statements for a living, who finds the sentence buried in paragraph 4 that changes the meaning of everything above it. Our joint account had a recurring transfer, $2,500, leaving on the 15th of every month, routed to an account under Dolores Whitfield's name. 6 years of it. I did the math sitting at my kitchen island at 4 in the morning while Julian slept 12 feet away. $180,000. Not a loan, not help with a mortgage that had already been paid off. A subscription to a woman who bragged at church about her provider son while quietly funneling half of it to bankroll her daughter's handbags and her son-in-law's beer money. Step 1 was small, almost surgical. I canceled the transfer. 1 click on a Wednesday morning. No note. No warning. Today was the 15th. In 3 hours, Dolores would try to pay her country club dues and discover the well had gone dry. Step 2 came faster than I expected, because Julian had just blown his slush fund on Grant's fake company and didn't have a spare dollar to cover his mother's shortfall, even if he'd wanted to. Dolores called him screaming. I heard his half of it through the bathroom door. "Mom, I don't know what happened. I'll figure it out. Just give me a day." He didn't once suspect it was me. That told me something important. In 6 years, it had never once occurred to my husband that I might notice. Step 3, I went further, because by then I wasn't interested in half measures. Dolores had lived rent-free for 4 years in a 2-bedroom condo in a building I owned through a holding company, Sablewood Properties LLC, that I had set up before Julian and I ever married, back when I bought my first investment property with agency profits. Julian believed he had arranged that living situation himself, some favor he'd called in through a college friend who managed the building. He never once asked to see the paperwork. If he had, he would have found my name on every page. I called my property manager, a woman named Renata I've worked with for 8 years, and told her, effective today, Dolores Whitfield is no longer a complimentary occupant. Draft a market rate lease, $8,500 a month, standard 5-day grace period, then proceed with eviction if unsigned. Dolores found out within the hour. She called Julian first, then Brianna. Then, apparently out of options, she called me directly. "There's been some kind of clerical error with my building," she said, her voice pitched into the specific register she used at church, warm and wounded at once. "The office is saying I owe rent." "There's no error," I said. "You've never owed rent because I've been covering it. I'm not covering it anymore." There was a long silence. Then she pivoted, the way she always pivoted, straight into guilt. "I raised that boy alone after Marcus died. Do you know what that took out of me? And this is how the family treats me, like a stranger being thrown into the street. You have 5 days," I said, and hung up. Between steps 3 and 4, Julian made his first real attempt to gaslight me directly, and it's worth telling because it's the moment I understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. He came home from work early on the Thursday, found me at the kitchen island going through statements, and asked with real concern in his voice whether I was doing okay, whether the stress of my father's health was making me act out of character. He suggested gently that maybe I should talk to someone, that cutting off his mother's rent and his brother-in-law's card wasn't like me, that this felt like a person spiraling rather than a person making decisions. For a moment, one brief, disorienting moment, I actually wondered if he was right. That's the part nobody tells you about people like Julian. It isn't that their manipulation is obviously cruel, it's that it borrows the language of care so convincingly that you start auditing your own sanity instead of theirs. I went back to the forged loan document that night, though I didn't know yet that it was forged, only that something about Grant's comment on the phone, that certainty that I already knew where the $15,000 had come from, had lodged itself under my skin. I didn't find it yet, but I stopped doubting myself. That was the real turning point, quieter than any of the account cancellations. The moment I stopped asking whether I was overreacting and started asking what, exactly, I hadn't been shown yet. Step 4 was Grant, and Grant was where the mask really started to slip. I killed his business credit card, the one attached to our joint account that Julian had begged me to add him to 18 months earlier for networking dinners, a card Grant had quietly used to fund golf memberships, and a home office renovation he called brand infrastructure. I canceled it on a Thursday morning. He was mid-swing at a golf pro shop in Ballantyne, with 2 men he'd been trying to convince to invest in Zenith Ventures when the card declined. He called me 40 minutes later, and there was no warmth left in his voice at all. "You can't just cut my funding," he said. "Do you understand what you just cost me? I had 2 investors standing right there." "I thought your whole philosophy was bootstrapping," I said. "Learn to build without dependency." "Isn't that the podcast?" He went quiet for a second. Then he got ugly, the way men like Grant get ugly when the performance stops working. "You're just a bitter, angry woman throwing a tantrum because your dad is sick and you can't control it, so you're taking it out on the people who actually love this family. Call Julian," I said. "Ask him where the $15,000 for Zenith's last round actually came from." He hung up fast. That told me he already knew. That told me this wasn't a secret Julian had kept from just me. Step 5, the one that mattered most, came from Brianna, and it was the moment the picture started to widen into something larger than I'd understood. She showed up at my office on a Friday afternoon, mascara pre-smudged in a way that looked less like crying and more like preparation, and she sat across from my desk and told me that Grant's expansion round was already in motion, that the paperwork was basically done, that Julian had told them the property would cover it, and they just needed me to stop being difficult about the account access. I asked her what property. She said too quickly. "The condo thing, obviously I don't know the details, that's Julian and Grant's business," and then caught herself and changed the subject to how disappointed their grandmother would be to see the family fractured like this. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was doing math again, a different kind. Sablewood Properties LLC, my holding company, my name on every document. And somewhere in a conversation I hadn't been part of, my husband had told his brother-in-law that my property would cover an investment round. I smiled at Brianna, the same smile I'd given Julian in the kitchen, and told her I hoped Grant's expansion went beautifully. She left looking more unsettled by my calm than she would have by my anger. Julian tried one more angle before the week was out, and it was the one that came closest to actually working. He sat me down that Saturday, took my hands across the kitchen table in a gesture so deliberately tender it felt rehearsed, and told me he'd been to see a cardiologist that week, that his own blood pressure had spiked badly enough to concern his doctor, that the stress of all this conflict was making him genuinely afraid for his health. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that his nephew, Brianna and Grant's 5-year-old Mason, had been asking why Uncle Julian seemed sad lately, why the family didn't do Sunday dinners anymore. "Is this really the family you want him growing up in?" Julian asked. "One where money matters more than people?" For a moment, a real moment, I felt the old pull, the instinct to smooth things over, to protect a child from adult consequences he had no part in creating. And then I thought about the folder in my hallway table, still taped together, still sitting there while Julian held my hands and talked about his blood pressure, and I understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't worried about Mason. He was using Mason, the same way he'd used my grief over my father, the same way his family used every soft feeling I had as a lever to move me somewhere convenient for them. "Take him to more Sunday dinners at your mother's house then," I said, pulling my hands back gently. "I'm not stopping you from being his uncle. I'm stopping funding a business I never agreed to fund." He didn't have a response to that. It was the first time in the whole ordeal that I watched him run out of angles entirely, sitting there at our kitchen table with nothing left to reach for. That night I went looking for whatever Julian meant when he said the property would cover it, because a man doesn't say a sentence like that about a house he's never once asked to see the deed for unless he already believes he has a way in. I found it in a manila envelope tucked behind the recycling bin in the garage, of all places, half shredded, like someone had started to destroy it and lost their nerve or their time. I hadn't gone looking for it specifically. I'd gone out to the garage to find the shredder itself, thinking I'd finally deal with 6 years of old bank statements I'd been meaning to clear out, and instead I found the shredder unplugged, a stack of half-fed paper jammed in its teeth, abandoned mid-task by someone who'd clearly been interrupted or lost his nerve. It took me 20 minutes on the kitchen floor at midnight, piecing it back together with packing tape like a jigsaw puzzle I hadn't asked to solve. When I finished, I sat back against the cabinets and read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining what it said. It was a collateral pledge agreement, 11 pages, from a private lender called Meridian Capital Partners, structuring a $175,000 loan to Zenith Ventures LLC. The collateral listed was the condo building on Selwyn Avenue, my condo building, owned by Sablewood Properties LLC, my holding company. And at the bottom of page 9, next to a line reading authorized signatory, was my signature. I have signed my name more times than I can count. account, on contracts, on leases, on wire authorizations. I know my own signature the way I know my own face. This wasn't it. It was close enough to fool a loan officer glancing through a stack of paperwork, but the eye in Imani leaned the wrong direction, and I never, not once in my life, crossed my 7. Whoever forged it had studied an old signature of mine, probably lifted off some document Julian had lying around the house, and hadn't accounted for the fact that I'd changed the way I wrote my 7s back in college, and never changed it back. There was a notary stamp beside it, and that was the detail that turned my stomach cold. The notary listed was a man named Corey Pruitt. I recognized the name. Corey Pruitt had been in Grant's wedding party, a groomsman I remembered mostly for a drunken toast about brotherhood that had run 11 minutes too long. Corey Pruitt worked in insurance, not law, and as far as I knew had never held a notary commission in his life. I called a friend from my agency days who'd gone on to become a real estate attorney, read her the document over the phone at 1 in the morning, my hands still faintly sticky with packing tape, and she went very quiet before she said carefully, "Imani, if what you're describing is accurate, this isn't a family dispute anymore. This is mortgage fraud and forgery. This is a felony." My attorney friend, whose name is Renee and who I'd known since business school, stayed on the phone with me for almost an hour that night, walking me through what she called the documentary reality versus the relational reality, a distinction she said she made for clients constantly, and one that would have been useful to hear years earlier. The relational reality was the marriage I thought I had, imperfect, unequal in ways I'd chosen to overlook, but fundamentally honest at its core. The documentary reality, the one sitting taped together on my kitchen floor, said something entirely different. It said that at some point, my husband had stopped seeing me as a partner whose consent mattered, and started seeing me as an asset to be leveraged, quietly, the same way Grant leveraged every failed business into the next one. "Does he know you found it?" Renee asked. "No." "Then here's what you don't do," she said. "You don't confront him tonight, angry, with no plan. You call me back tomorrow morning, we get you a real attorney who handles this specifically, and we build a file before you say a single word to him about it. People like this, when they're cornered without a plan already in motion against them, they destroy evidence. You have exactly one advantage right now, which is that he doesn't know that you know." I asked her before we hung up whether she thought I was overreacting, whether there was some innocent explanation I was missing in my exhaustion and grief. She was quiet for a moment. "Imani," she said, "I've read a lot of contracts in my career. Nobody accidentally forges a notary stamp. That's not a mistake you stumble into. That's a decision, made carefully, by someone who assumed you'd never look closely enough to catch it." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, staring at the taped-together pages spread across my kitchen floor, the same floor Grant had once stood on lecturing me about dependency culture. I thought about all the ways I'd protected Julian's pride for 6 years, softening my income, staying quiet at family dinners, absorbing insults dressed as jokes, and I thought about how none of that carefulness had ever once been reciprocated, how the one time his interests and my assets intersected, he hadn't asked me. He'd forged me. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The date on the document stopped me longest. It was dated 11 days before the stroke, before the fight in the kitchen, before any of this had started unraveling in front of me. I checked the date 3 separate times, certain I'd misread it, certain some part of my brain was trying to construct the worst possible version of events out of simple coincidence. It wasn't coincidence. 11 days. I sat with the number until it stopped feeling abstract and started feeling like a confession, because it meant, while I was crying over my dying father and Julian was straightening his tie and telling me my money was mine and his money was his, he already knew. He had already forged my name onto a document pledging my property to secure a loan for his brother-in-law's fake company, and then he'd stood there and lectured me about the sanctity of separate finances, because separate finances were exactly what he needed me to believe in. If I thought his money was his and mine was mine, I'd never think to check what he was doing with what he believed, wrongly, was still partly his to leverage. The plant, the one I hadn't let myself see clearly until that moment, clicked into place. Grant in my office weeks earlier, joking about how Julian always knew how to make things work out. Brianna in my office days ago, saying the paperwork was basically done, that the property would cover it. They hadn't been careless. They'd been waiting on me to sign something I'd never actually agreed to, believing I'd never look closely enough to notice, because for 6 years I never had. Julian came home the next evening with his whole family in tow, which told me they'd planned this together, an ambush dressed up as an intervention. Dolores walked in first, holding the eviction notice like a subpoena. Brianna trailed behind her, arms crossed, chin already tilted toward righteous. Grant came last, phone in hand, probably recording, probably hoping to catch me looking unstable so he'd have something to post later about the dependency culture I apparently represented. Julian didn't even take off his coat. "You need to fix this," he said. "All of it. The transfer, my mother's lease, Grant's card, tonight." "Or what?" I said. "Or I'm done," he said. "I'll file for divorce and I'll take half of everything, Imani. The agency, the properties, all of it. You built this life during our marriage. Courts don't care whose name is prettier on the paperwork." Dolores stepped forward at that point, still holding the eviction notice like it might change what it said if she gripped it tightly enough, and added her own weight to the ultimatum. "Imani, honey, think about what you're doing to this family. Think about Mason. Think about what people will say at church." Brianna nodded along beside her, arms still crossed crossed, playing the part she'd clearly rehearsed on the drive over. Grant said nothing yet, just kept his phone angled toward me, waiting for a reaction he could use. I set my wine glass down slowly on the counter, the same counter Grant had scratched weeks earlier, and I looked at my husband for a long moment before I answered him. "A divorce," I said. "Sounds perfect." His face changed. It was small at first, a flicker, the particular panic of a man who has just realized the script he memorized doesn't match the room he's standing in. He recovered fast, the way he always did, and pivoted to contempt. "You think a judge is going to side with a woman who cut off a dying grandmother's rent and starved my nephew's college fund out of spite? You'll look insane." "Funny," I said, "that you'd bring up looking insane considering what's sitting in my briefcase." I walked to the hallway table, retrieved the folder, and set it on the kitchen island between us. 11 pages, taped back together, my forged signature circled in red pen. I didn't say anything. I let them read it themselves. Dolores read first, and I watched something in her collapse in real time, the church voice warmth draining out of her face as she got to page 9. "Julian," she said very quietly, "what is this?" "It's nothing. It's a formality, Mom. It's not what it looks like. It's a forged notary stamp," I said, "on a fraudulent collateral pledge, using property you don't own, to secure a $175,000 loan for your brother-in-law's company. Corey Pruitt isn't a notary, Julian. I checked. He sells car insurance in Matthews." Grant's phone, which had been recording, slowly lowered, Brianna's arms uncrossed. Whatever performance they'd rehearsed on the drive over evaporated, because you cannot perform righteousness over a felony with your mother standing right there reading the proof. "You did this," Dolores said, turning on her son, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard directed at him before, something that sounded almost like fear on his behalf. "You used my grandsons. You used the family name on a document that could put you in prison, Julian. Do you understand that? Do you understand what you've done?" "Mom, it's fine. It was going to be fine." "It is not fine." Her voice cracked on the word, and for the first time in 9 years I watched Dolores Whitfield look genuinely frightened instead of performing an emotion for an audience. "Your father built a name in this city he could be proud of. I did not raise you to put a felony next to it because Grant can't hold a job for longer than a golf season." Grant's head snapped up at that. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Dolores said, and I realized watching her that whatever loyalty she'd extended to her son-in-law over the years had never been about believing in him. It had been about maintaining the appearance of a family that had its act together, and that appearance had just been shattered on my kitchen island in front of the one person she couldn't afford to lose face in front of, which, it turned out, was herself. "I was going to pay it back before anyone noticed," Julian said, and it was the most honest sentence I'd heard him say in 9 years, and it was somehow the worst one. "It was supposed to be temporary. Grant said the round would close in 60 days. We'd refinance. Nobody would even know. I would have known," I said. "It's my building. It's my company. It's my signature you stole to do it." I looked around the kitchen at all 4 of them, at Grant staring at the floor now instead of his phone, at Brianna's mascara finally earning its smudges, at Dolores's hand pressed flat against her own chest like she was trying to hold something in, and then I looked at Julian. "You told me my dying father was my problem alone," I said. "You stood right there and said it, and this whole time, while you were saying it, you already had a plan to steal from me to fund your sister's husband's fantasy business. I hope it was worth it." "Imani, please," Dolores tried again, softer now, the church voice cracking under its own weight. "We can fix this quietly. Families fix things quietly. Families don't forge each other's signatures, Dolores," I said. "That's not a family. That's a scheme with a Christmas card attached." I picked my wine glass back up. "The divorce papers are already drafted," I said. "I had them done Wednesday. You can read them tonight, or you can read them after I call Meridian Capital Partners and the district attorney's office tomorrow morning. Your choice." Nobody said anything for a long time. Outside, I could hear the traffic on the street 30 floors below, ordinary and indifferent to the fact that a marriage had just ended in my kitchen, in front of the very family that had helped kill it. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up before 6, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat at my kitchen island making a list, the way I make lists for every client crisis my agency has ever handled, because treating my own life like a case file was the only way I knew how to keep my hands from shaking. Call Renee. Call the real attorney she'd recommended, a woman named Priscilla Odom who specialized in financial fraud within family structures, a subspecialty I hadn't known existed until I needed it. Call my accountant to pull every Sablewood document going back 5 years. Change the locks. Change the locks was underlined twice. I did call Meridian Capital Partners the next morning, and then I called an attorney, and by the following week I had also, reluctantly, filed a report with the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office, because my lawyer told me plainly that if I didn't, and this ever came out later, I could be implicated for knowledge I hadn't acted on. Meridian froze the loan within 48 hours, once their underwriting team confirmed the notary commission on file for Corey Pruitt had lapsed 3 years earlier and had never covered real estate transactions even when active. An investigator called me twice that week, polite, methodical, asking questions I answered as plainly as I could. He asked me near the end of the second call whether I'd had any indication beforehand that Julian was capable of something like this. I told him the truth, that I hadn't, not specifically, but that looking back there had been years of smaller indications I'd simply chosen to interpret generously. He didn't say anything to that, just thanked me for my my time, but I've thought about the question often since, because I think it's the one every person in a story like mine eventually has to sit with alone. Julian was never arrested, not in those first weeks, though his attorney spent late nights negotiating what I understood, secondhand, to be a restitution agreement to avoid formal charges. Priscilla explained it to me plainly, with no prior record, a full confession to the forgery once confronted with the physical evidence, and restitution paid in full within 90 days. The DA's office was inclined toward a pretrial diversion program rather than prosecution, provided I, as the victim, didn't object. I sat with that word for a long time, victim, turning it over like a stone I didn't recognize, because it didn't match the picture I had of myself, a woman who ran a 7-figure agency and had, by every external measure, built an enviable life. But Priscilla told me something I've held on to since. Financial abuse doesn't check your bank balance before it happens to you. It only checks whether you were paying enough attention. I told the DA's office I wouldn't object to diversion, not out of forgiveness, but because I understood, watching Julian's face when he signed the restitution agreement in Priscilla's conference room, that prison wouldn't have taught him anything my divorce filing hadn't already taught him faster. I didn't ask for details after that. I didn't want them anymore. Priscilla Odom turned out to be exactly the kind of ally I didn't know I needed. A woman in her 50s with a corner office full of framed newspaper clippings about cases she'd won, who looked at the taped-together loan document for exactly 90 seconds before saying, "This is one of the cleaner forgery cases I've seen in a while, which is going to work entirely in your favor and entirely against him." She walked me through what came next with a calm that steadied me more than any of Julian's apologies ever could have, because her calm was competence, not manipulation. She explained that Meridian's fraud investigators would build their own file independent of mine, that the DA's office would likely offer Julian a pretrial diversion given his lack of prior record, and that my job, the only job that mattered, was to stay quiet, stay documented, and let the paperwork do what paperwork does when it's this thoroughly damning. She also recommended, gently but firmly, that I get a forensic accountant to trace every dollar of the $2,500 a month going back 6 years. Not for the DA, she said, but for you, so you have the full number in front of you and can stop wondering. I hired the accountant that same week. The full number, when it finally came back 3 weeks later, was $182,400, more than I'd estimated at my kitchen island at 4 in the morning, and somehow the extra $2,400 was the detail that made me angriest of anything in the entire ordeal, because it meant even my own math, done carefully, had underestimated what I'd been giving away. The divorce moved faster than I expected, mostly because Julian's attorney seemed to understand, better than Julian did, how badly a jury of Charlotte homeowners would receive the story of a man who forged his wife's signature to fund his brother-in-law's beer money and golf memberships. There was no prenup, which had worried me for years in the abstract, but it turned out not to matter the way I'd feared, because Sablewood Properties LLC had been formed 4 years before our marriage, funded with money earned before our marriage, and every dollar since had been documented, invoiced, and kept scrupulously separate by a woman who had apparently, without fully admitting it to herself, been protecting herself against exactly this outcome for longer than she'd realized. Julian's attorney tried, briefly, to argue that marital labor had contributed to the appreciation of those assets. My attorney produced 6 years of tax filings that told a different story. Julian walked away with his 401k, his car, and roughly $4,000 from our joint checking account, which was, by then, all that remained in it. The family did not split the way I expected. Grant and Brianna closed ranks around Julian almost immediately, because Grant needed Julian's silence about the loan almost as much as Julian needed Grant's, and self-preservation makes for strange loyalty. Grant's podcast, Bootstrap Nation, quietly stopped uploading new episodes about 6 weeks after the story broke through the family group chat, which Dolores, in a moment I still can't quite believe, forwarded to me directly, unprompted, with a message that read only, "You should see what they're saying about you. I'm sorry, Imani. I should have asked more questions a long time ago." Zenith Ventures LLC was administratively dissolved by the state 8 months later for failure to file its annual report, a bureaucratic whimper of an ending for a company that had cost my marriage its foundation. Grant took a sales job at a mattress showroom in University City, which Brianna mentioned to me once, flatly, without the usual gloss she used to put on Grant's ventures, and I understood from her tone that something in her, too, had finally stopped believing the performance. Brianna and I never fully repaired anything, but we reached a kind of quiet detente I hadn't expected. She texted me on my birthday that first year, a short message, no explanation, just thinking of you today, and I didn't know what to do with it except answer kindly and let it be exactly as small as it was. I don't think Brianna will ever fully reckon with her own part in what happened, the years of small dishonesties and larger silences, but I've stopped needing her to for my own peace. Some people give you the whole apology. Some people give you a birthday text and you decide, for your own sake, to let that be enough. I hadn't expected an apology from Dolores, of all people, and I still don't entirely trust it, but I've learned that people can be genuinely sorry and still be the reason something broke in the first place, and both things can be true at once. The other unexpected ally was Marcus's younger brother, Julian's Uncle Theo, a quiet man I'd met maybe 6 times in 9 years, mostly at holidays, always sitting slightly outside the main conversation with a drink he nursed slowly, while everyone else performed confirmed for Dolores's approval. He called me 2 months after the divorce filing, out of nowhere, and told me he'd watched that family eat people alive for 30 years and had never once said anything because it wasn't his place. "It's still not really my place," he said, "but I wanted you to know somebody in that family saw what was happening to you before this, and I'm sorry nobody said it out loud sooner." He told me a story I hadn't known about Marcus, Julian's father, who apparently used to say the same thing to his own wife decades earlier, that her family's problems weren't his, until Marcus's own mother needed hospice care in her final year, and Dolores was the one who quietly paid for most of it without ever mentioning it to anyone, because that, Theo said, was simply what people who actually loved each other did without needing credit for it. It was a strange, sad little footnote to the whole story, a reminder that the pattern hadn't started with Julian. It had just been waiting for someone new to marry into it. I ran into Julian once, unplanned, at a mutual friend's wedding in the fall after the divorce was final, a wedding I almost skipped, and I'm still glad I didn't. He was standing near the bar, alone, in a suit that fit him worse than the ones I used to pick out, and when our eyes met across the reception tent, he gave me a small nod, nothing more, and I gave him one back, and that was the entire exchange. No confrontation, no closure speech, just two people who used to build a life together, acknowledging briefly that the life no longer existed. I spent the rest of that night on the dance floor with people who actually knew how to celebrate something without keeping score, and I drove home at midnight feeling lighter than I expected to, like a door I'd been bracing against had finally, quietly, clicked shut on its own. Dolores lost the condo, obviously, though I gave her the full 5 days, and then, against the advice of literally everyone including my own mother, quietly extended it to 30 so she'd have time to find something smaller. I didn't do it for her. I did it because I didn't want to become someone who needed to watch a 66-year-old woman get physically removed from a building to feel like justice had been served. She found a 1-bedroom in Pineville eventually, paid for herself for the first time in years, and I heard through Brianna, who still occasionally texts me updates I never asked for, that Dolores took a part-time job at a school district office, the first job she'd held since retiring. I don't know what that means about her. I don't know if it's growth or just necessity wearing growth's clothes. I try not to need an answer to that question anymore. She sends me a Christmas card every year now, signed only Dolores, none of the flourish she used to add about family and legacy, and I keep them in a kitchen drawer I haven't decided what to do with yet. My father recovered more than the doctors initially expected, though his left hand still doesn't fully close around a coffee mug, and he walks with a cane he complains about constantly and refuses to use consistently, which terrifies my mother and makes me laugh despite myself, because it is exactly the kind of stubbornness that raised me. He asked about Julian only once, weeks after the divorce was final, sitting on his porch with the cane propped against his knee. He really said I was your problem, he said, not really a question. In your own kitchen, I told him yes. My father was quiet for a while, looking out at the yard where he'd collapsed months earlier, at the porch swing that still creaked the same way it always had, indifferent to how close it had come to being the last place he ever sat. 38 years I carried mail through every kind of weather this city has, he finally said, so my kids would never have to depend on somebody who didn't want them. Then he looked at me directly. Good thing you didn't need him to be right about that. I didn't cry in front of him. I waited until I was back in my car in his driveway, and then I let myself have exactly 10 minutes of it, because some griefs deserve a scheduled appointment and nothing more. There is a version of grief in this story that has nothing to do with money or fraud or forged signatures, and it's the one that surprised me most. I grieved the version of Julian I married, the 26-year-old who made a fundraiser gala feel warm just by walking into it, the man who used to leave notes on the bathroom mirror before big client pitches. I don't think that man was entirely a lie. I think he was real, and also weak, and also raised by a family that taught him love was a resource to be extracted rather than built, and I think both of those things about him can be true without excusing what he did. I mourned him the way you mourn a house you used to live in after it's been sold to someone else, not because you want to move back in, but because it was the shape your life used to take, and shapes leave outlines even after they're gone. I found the note he'd left on the bathroom mirror the morning of our 4th anniversary, while I was packing up the penthouse bathroom, dry erase marker faded almost to nothing, a heart drawn next to the words, "Proud of you today and every day." I stood there holding it for a long time before I wiped it away with my thumb, because keeping it felt dishonest about who he'd turned out to be, and throwing it away felt dishonest about who he'd actually been in that specific, ordinary morning 4 years earlier. I settled for something in between. I photographed it, then wiped it clean, then packed the mirror into a box like it was just glass, because that's mostly what it was. There is also a version of this story where I have to be honest about my own blind spots, because I don't think self-awareness means only cataloging what was done to me. I let Julian believe a lie about our finances for 6 years because it was easier than having the harder conversation about what his ego needed to survive contact with my success. I told myself that was generosity. Some of it was. But some of it was also avoidance, a way of not finding out what kind of man I'd married if I ever stopped managing the optics around him. I got my answer eventually, the hard way, the way you usually get answers you spent years avoiding. The logistics took the better part of a year to fully untangle. Selling the penthouse, since neither of us wanted to live in the rooms where that kitchen scene happened. Buying myself a smaller place in Dilworth with a garden I actually have time to tend now. Renegotiating vendor contracts at the agency that had quietly listed Julian as an emergency contact for 6 years, a detail that stung more than I expected when I found it. Small and administrative and somehow more personal than the forged signature had been. I updated it to my father, then reconsidered, given everything his own body had already survived, and settled on Dana instead, who cried a little when I asked her, which surprised us both. Untangling the health insurance took 3 phone calls and a certified letter. Untangling the joint credit card that had somehow, over 6 years, accumulated Julian's name as primary and mine as authorized user, despite the fact that I'd opened the account, took considerably longer, and involved a customer service escalation that ate an entire Tuesday afternoon I never got back. None of it was dramatic. All of it was exhausting in the particular way that endings are. Less a single door slamming and more 100 small doors closing one at a time over the course of many ordinary Tuesdays. Explaining to my staff, in careful professional language, why my last name was changing back on the business filings. My office manager, a woman named Yolanda, who'd worked for me for 5 years and who'd been in the room the day Grant called screaming about his golf pro shop, asked me once, gently, over lunch, why I hadn't told any of them sooner what was happening at home. I didn't have a clean answer for her. I think part of me had spent so long being the person who handled things, for clients, for staff, for Julian's family, for my own parents, that I'd forgotten it was allowed to be handled for, occasionally, by someone else. Yolanda started scheduling my calendar differently after that, blocking off Friday afternoons with a note that just said, protected, without ever explaining to anyone what it protected me from. I never asked her to do that. I've never removed it either. My friends, the handful I'd kept close through the marriage despite Julian's family slowly crowding out most of my weekends, reacted in ways that told me things about myself I hadn't fully clocked. My closest friend from college, Dana, who'd been the maid of honor at my wedding, admitted over wine about a month after the divorce filing that she'd never liked how small I made myself around Julian's mother, that she'd noticed it at the wedding itself and told herself it was just a phase, a new marriage adjustment I'd grow out of. You didn't grow out of it, she said. You just got better at hiding that you'd noticed too. I sat with that for a long time. I still sit with it sometimes. None of it was dramatic. All of it was exhausting in the particular way that endings are. Less a single door slamming and more 100 small doors closing one at a time over the course of many ordinary Tuesdays. I'm 34 now. The agency signed its largest client yet last spring, a healthcare system rebrand worth more than Julian made in the 4 years I knew him combined. And I remember sitting in that closing meeting and feeling, for the first time in a long while, like my success belonged entirely to me, uncomplicated by anyone else's ego, needing to be managed around it. I still see my father every Sunday. He still refuses to use his cane properly. My mother still makes too much food and sends me home with containers I never finish before they go bad. And I've stopped minding that because it means she's still cooking for a family, even if the shape of that family looks different than it used to. My father's left hand has gotten stronger than the doctors initially promised, enough that he can hold a coffee mug steady most mornings now, though he still drops things when he's tired, and my mother still flinches every time a glass hits the floor, a small permanent echo of that Tuesday none of us have fully outrun. I bought them a house closer to mine 2 years ago, a single story on a quiet street in Matthews with a ramp built into the front porch that my father insisted, loudly, he didn't need and then used every single day. I didn't tell him it was partly funded by the restitution payment that finally cleared from Julian's attorney 11 months after the divorce was final. Some money is better spent than explained. I started dating again last year, carefully, slowly, and I've noticed I ask different questions now than I used to. Not about income, not about ambition, but about how a person talks about the people who raised them, whether generosity in their family stories runs in one direction or two. It's a small diagnostic, imperfect, but it's mine, earned the expensive way, and I trust it more than I trust most things. I went on a second date recently with a man who, when I mentioned my father's stroke, immediately asked how he was doing now, this year, rather than asking how much his care had cost. I noticed the difference the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm you can't yet see. I don't know where that will go. I've stopped needing to know things that far in advance. I don't talk to Julian. I heard secondhand through Brianna's increasingly rare updates that he moved to Raleigh, that he's selling medical devices for a smaller company now, that the restitution agreement quietly closed the criminal matter without a formal conviction on his record, which some days I resent and other days I'm grateful for, because a felony record helps no one heal, not even the person who deserves consequences. I heard he's dating someone new, a woman Brianna described only as nice, quiet, and I found, when I heard that I didn't feel the jealousy I might have expected, only a small private hope that he'd learned something, and a smaller, more honest hope that if he hadn't, it would land on someone else's kitchen island next time and not mine. I don't know if he's happy. I've stopped being the kind of person who needs to know. What I understand now, in a way I didn't at 32, standing in that kitchen with my phone shaking in my hand, is that love without honesty isn't really love, it's management. I had been managing Julian's ego for 6 years the way you manage a difficult client, softening my own success, funding a lifestyle he took credit for, absorbing his family's contempt as the cost of keeping peace. I called that love because it looked like sacrifice, and I'd been taught, the way most of us are taught, that sacrifice is what love is made of. But sacrifice without respect isn't a marriage. It's a subscription you keep renewing because canceling feels like like failure. He stood in our kitchen and told me my dying father was my problem alone. I think about that sentence often, not because it still hurts the way it used to, but because it was, in its own ugly way, the truest thing he ever said to me. He was telling me, as clearly as he knew how, that I had always been alone in that marriage, carrying weight he never intended to share, propping up a version of partnership that only ever ran in one direction. I just hadn't been ready to hear it yet. I am not going to tell you this ended in triumph, because it didn't, not entirely. Something real broke that I had genuinely believed in once, and I don't think you get to walk away from 9 years of a person's life without carrying some of that weight forward, no matter how justified the ending was. But I have a garden now. I have a father who still argues with his cane, and a mother who still cooks too much, and an agency that has never once needed me to make myself smaller to protect someone else's pride. My dying father was never my problem alone. He was mine to love freely, without anyone standing in a kitchen telling me love came with conditions. I finally understand the difference. It only cost me everything I thought I couldn't survive losing to learn it.